Wonderful. It's so wonderful to be here with you. And I'm just going to start with a blessing for studying the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We're going to soak ourselves in some Job. We had a great class last week where we focused on the very beginning of the book, what we called the frame story. And today we're going to be talking about the meat of the book in just a moment. But I'd like to just have a moment where if anybody would like to dedicate our learning to anyone who is top of mind or top of heart for you, feel free to place that in the chat. If you'd like to dedicate some of the merit that we are accruing from studying Torah, feel free to put that in the chat. I will be dedicating our learning to my father, Leib Yosef ben Sarah. And I want to let you know that today I'm going to try to be doing a little bit more proportionally of talking and a little less of question answering, just because we have a lot of text to get to. I'm hoping next time we'll change that proportion a little bit, but we will stop for questions at least once or twice. And feel free to put your questions and your comments in the chat box, and we can hopefully eventually relate to them. Thank you for putting your dedications, and we will hold all of them and all of their the people memories who we are remembering, and all of the refuah shlemas, the healing for all that require it and could use it. So for Job today, I want to say that before, in our previous class, again, we focused on the frame story, the fable, as we called it, of Job, where we had this story of, you know, the Satan who, excuse me for just a second, I'm going to turn my phone off. Sorry, I didn't do that before. We had the story of the Satan who comes to God when God's kind of bragging about how great Job is, and the Satan who sets in motion really horrible suffering, tragedy and traumatic suffering for Job and his entire family, where his whole, all of his children are killed, and his wealth is taken away, and eventually his health is taken away, and his comfort is taken away. And that's where we ended last time. And we had a lot of questions about why God would do this and what Job's responses should be, which are usually the way that we talk about this book. But I want to suggest something which might be a little radical, which is that I don't think that the author of the book of Job centrally cared either about God and God's response, or Job and Job's response. And I'll tell you why I think so, and it's on your sheet. Because if we just look at the outline of the book of Job, right on the first page, Roman numeral 1, chapter 1 to 2 is a frame story or fable that we looked at last time. We'll start this week when we do our text study with chapter 3, when Job curses. And then we'll see that there are 3 cycles of having usually 3 friends, the same 3 friends, and usually the same order, speak to Job and Job's responses. And then following that, we have a new character who comes in, Elihu. I can't wait to talk about him. He's my favorite now, right, to talk about in this book. And then it's only at the end, and this is what we'll cover next week, when God responds and Job responds to God, but mainly it's God's response. So if you just look at what the author spends the most time on in this book, By far, the author's concern is the friends, is these three cycles of these friends coming and speaking to Job. And so my suggestion is that our author, more than wanting to untangle this knot of why do bad things happen to good people, of theodicy, which we'll talk more about, more than that, our author wants to explore what it's like to either have a friend who tries to comfort you while you're suffering, or how to be a friend who is trying to comfort someone in their suffering. That's the bulk of the book that we have. And so I want to jump into it and see what happens. Before I do, though, I'll say one word about this word theodicy, which is the study of God and evil. And theodicy has three propositions, and it's one of these. 2 out of 3 can work, but in our world, 3 don't work together. The 3 are: God is all powerful, God is all good, and evil exists. How do you reconcile an all-powerful, good God with the fact that there's suffering in the world? That's theodicy. And in the book of Job, we can even drill down on that a bit. We can say God is all powerful, God is all good, and Job is a good person, right? We've been told that Job actually hasn't done anything to bring any of the suffering upon himself. So how can God be all powerful and all good, and Job be a good person? So what we're going to see is, as the friends and Job struggle with how to reconcile these different propositions, the friends are going to be pushing on the idea that Job's a good person. Job must have done something to deserve this, right? That's the nature of the world. And Job is going to be pushing not on the fact that God is all powerful. Job is experiencing just how powerful God is. But Job is going to be pushing on the idea that maybe God isn't all good. Maybe. Just pushing on. And I see a great question here. Is good human-centric? It's a great question. And I'm even going to suggest that when we get to next week's class, if we had more time to look into the poetry even this week, we're going to see that from the divine perspective, right, when we're looking at the whole world, we're going to be absolutely looking beyond just the human world. And that's really where we move towards next week, right? We'll have a little bit of that this week. Another note before we start chapter 3. This is not a philosophical treatise. This is poetry. And especially now that we've moved out of the first 2 chapters of prose, we're moving into poetic language. And when we have biblical Hebrew poetry, you need to, in some ways, forget what you learned about poetry, at least in elementary school, about each line rhyming, because in biblical Hebrew poetry, rhyming is the easiest thing in the world. Everything has matching suffixes, right? Rhyming is no big deal. Biblical Hebrew poetry works through parallelism, through saying something one way and then saying it another way. And so a lot of synonyms. And what we'll find today too is a lot of intensification, saying something one way and then just kind of ratcheting up the tension, or the imagery in the second parallel. We're going to see this immediately in chapter 3. You'll see, for example, the words choshech and salmavet together, darkness's death shadow, right? That evocative language followed in the next verse by Anana Kimrire Yom, the cloud mass of day gloom, right? You can just hear like this very creative kind of both creating words in some cases, but creating words that don't normally go together to create moods, right? And that's really what's going to happen right here in chapter 3. We're going to create a mood almost instantly, and we're almost there. The only thing I wanted to say by way of introduction is that one of the commentators I really focused it on and translated in preparing is Dr. Raymond Shindlin, who wrote a translation and commentary in the book of Job. He says Job is more a work of consolation than theology, and that the consolation itself comes not through the ideas, but through the poetry, through the use of language itself. So we're going to be looking at that. And I'm also going to suggest that certainly the consolation is not coming through Job's friends. You know, in my own notes, I have this session, titled like his so-called friends, right? And I'll also say, and the mansplainer. And I hope we get to the mansplainer as well. The only other thing to say are these two things. One, I had to make a lot of choices in this class about what to present, and I chose to follow a narrative strain. My idea is that we're going to go through the first cycle of the 3 poem speeches that come in this section, and we're going to look at a little piece of each of the friends in this first poem cycle and Job. And then we'll be able to reflect a little bit more about what happens in the second and third cycle and how it closes out before God enters the picture through God's own words and voice. I did not always pick the most famous or the most beautiful poetry. I hope our learning together whets your appetite and you will go back and look at the entire book of Job later, but do not fear, we will be seeing some extraordinary poetry together too. Okay, chapter 3, Job's curse. This is the title that many people give to this first section. And I'm just going to start to read. I often chose for these selections right at the beginning. So this is right after the frame story ends. The last thing we heard was that Job's 3 friends came from far distances after they heard what had happened to him. And they come, and what do? Oh, these are such good friends. They just come and they sit with him for 7 days in silence. He doesn't speak, they don't speak. And so our first speaker now in chapter 3 is Job. And Job says, so we have the narrator tell us, Achrechen patach Iyov et pihu v'yikalel et yomo. Then Job opens his mouth and cursed his day. And I just want to point out, for those of you who are thinking, I thought Job was supposed to be the patient. Job is not patient. Job is frustrated, and Job is angry, and Job is demoralized. Many of the commentaries I saw said that one reason the book of Job made it into the canon was because the rabbis wanted Jews to know they could be angry and frustrated and demoralized by their suffering and take that to God, that that's part of what we can do. But I do want to point out, with our close reading lenses, that it says, Vaikalel et yomo, that Job curses his day. He doesn't curse God. This to me seems hugely significant. He's cursing his experience. He's cursing his day, but he's not cursing all creation or the creator. All right, so how does he do this? He raises his voice, Va'ya'an Iyov Vayomer, and says, Yovad yom ivaled bo. Blot out the day I was born. V'halayla amar hore gaver. And the night that said, a man is conceived. This is a perfect example of our both parallelism and our intensification. First, he says, curse the day I was born, blot it out, annul it, cancel it. I wish it hadn't happened. I wish I'd never been born. And then he goes back, not just the day he was born, but the night he was conceived should have never happened. He goes back to his very conception. I shouldn't have been conceived. That day, let it be darkness. No God look after it from above. No light flood it, foul it, darkness, death, gloom. Let a cloud mass rest upon it. Let day gloom turn it to horror. You can notice even in just this little selection, how prominent words of darkness appear. And I can tell you that the words night and darkness appear 7 times in this chapter, in addition to other night and darkness word clusters. The 7 words are just specifically night or darkness, not even this gloom and terror, right? And so immediately, where the narrator wants to take us, where the author wants to take us, is Job's lived experience. We're not getting platitudes. We're getting his suffering, right? An expression of his mind state. And it is dark and it is bitter. He is not saying, okay, well, if God wants it, I should accept it. He wishes he hadn't been born. He's not cursing God, but he is cursing his own suffering and the fact of it, and wishing it could be otherwise, which, by the way, is the definition of suffering, if you think about it. And so we meet Job here in his suffering and pain, and we start in his voice. But very soon after, chapter 4, we get Eliphaz the Temanite, who's going to be speaking in chapter 4 and 5. And I brought short selections from each of these chapters. And Eliphaz of the friends is seen to be perhaps the most thoughtful. He's the elder among them. He speaks first. And we can see that he starts out pretty well, right? Vaya'an Eliphaz haTemani vayomer. And now Eliphaz opens to speak and says, Hanisa davar elecha tla'a va'atzor b'milin mi yuchal. And Eliphaz the Temanite spoke out and he said, if speech were tried against you, could you stand it? Yet who can hold back words? So he starts out saying, who can even talk about what's happening to you? Who could stand even hearing about it? Which is the wisest thing he says, and I wish he had stopped, right? But then the next thing he says is, I think, a beautiful prologue to everything we're going to see from the friends. He says, yet who can hold back words, right? It's human nature. We come for the Shiva call, we hear someone suffering, and we want to say something about it. We want not only to say, I'm so sorry, or, that sounds really hard. Who can hold back words to try to make meaning from it, to try to say, oh, well, God must have needed another angel, whatever the things that people try to say are, justifications. He says, I know nothing I say can even be sensical to your experience, but who can hold back words? And now we're just going to see a lot of words, Look, you were always the one to instruct the many, to strengthen failing hands. You, Job, You were the greatest man in the East, we just heard last time. Everyone came to you for advice. You advised dozens, hundreds. And now, right? Now it comes to you and you cannot stand it. It reaches you and you are dismayed, right? And so it's saying, in the beginning, Eliphaz starts out okay, saying words are not going to work here. And then he moves into, you who used to counsel other people, why are you cursing your day, right? Why are you using your words in this way now? Which seems at best insensitive and unhelpful. I think we can agree, but it's going to get worse. And then in chapter 5, all of these, by the way, that I'm saying, I made kind of a funky, in the beginning, I made kind of a funky mashup of my translation in English from Robert Alter's amazing translation and Raymond Shinlin's translation. Later, I just moved to Safaria's translation and sometimes substituted a word or two that I thought was a better choice. So here we are in chapter 5, verses 17 through 19. This is Robert Alter's translation. Why, happy the man whom God corrects, Shaddai's reproof do not spurn. Meaning, look, you should be happy God's paying attention to you at all. You should be happy that God is clearly, being involved in your life and giving you this suffering so that you can grow from it. For God causes pain and binds the wound. God deals blows, but God's hands will heal. In 6 straits, God will save you, and in 7, harm will not touch you. Eliphaz is trying to bring comfort, saying, God, who is causing your suffering, will actually cause your healing. And then finally, 24 through 27, and you shall know that your tent is peaceful. Probe your home and find nothing amiss. I find this cruel. I find this brutal. He has just lost his 10 children. And Eliphaz, by way of comfort, says, your home is going to feel like home again. Nothing will be amiss. And you shall know that your seed is abundant, your offspring like the grass of the earth. In this round, we sense that Eliphaz is trying to be comforting, but I just think he's being brutal. I just don't understand how he can talk about his house and his seed when he's lost all of his children. The final verses, 26 and 27, and you shall come to the grave in vigor, as grain shocks mount in their season. Look, this we have searched. It is so. Eliphaz ends in this idea of, trust me, I've thought about this. I know I'm right. Hear it, and you should know. Just notice, again, using our close reading, in verse 27, he says, look, this we have searched becomes first person plural, like we know, we've thought about it. How can anybody know anything about Job's situation who hasn't gone through it? But then it switches in the last line, hear it, listen to us. This whole part of the book is each friend wanting to be heard. Hear it, listen to me, listen to my words. And you, right? Second person direct, you should know. Just, for anyone who has any pastoral experience, this is a complete failure. This is exactly what you should not do. I know you don't know about your own suffering. Listen to me. Get over it. God, this is good. You should be happy for your suffering. And look, it's all going to get better. Someone put in the chat, right, that this is just negating his suffering. And sadly, this is almost kind of the best of what we're going to get from the friends. It's just gonna get worse from here. Chapter 8. I'm going to go through the three friends and Job's response, and then I'm going to stop for a big block of question and answer. That's my plan. Chapter 8, Bildad the Shuhite. So Bildad the Shuhite says in reply, this is verses 1-6, how long will you speak such things? He's now replying to Job. Job's had a couple of chapters of a response where he basically says, thanks, but no thanks to all of Eliphaz's consolation and philosophy. How long will you speak such things? Your utterances are a mighty wind. Will God pervert the right? Will the Almighty pervert justice? Meaning everything that's happening to you should happen to you. If God's doing it, then clearly, it's just by the fact that it's happening. But this is where, to me, again, he goes into the cruel territory. If your sons sinned against God, God dispatched them for their transgression. Some commentators see this as Bildad trying to say, I'm not accusing you, Job, but if your kids were all killed on the same day, then they must have deserved it. They must have done something to deserve it, which again, just feels incredibly, incredibly cruel. But if you seek God and supplicate the Almighty, if you are blameless and upright, God will protect you. And then 2 verses on, verses 8-10, ask the generation past, study what their fathers have searched out. For we are of yesterday and know nothing. Our days on earth are a shadow. Surely they will teach you and tell you, speaking out of their understanding. Bildad finishes differently than Eliphaz. He says, listen, Job, you're a speck of dirt. We all are. We don't know anything. But our sages, they knew something. Go back and look at what their teachings were. Don't trust yourself. Don't trust your own ideas of suffering or your own experience. Okay. I just want to say, I guess my own note here is everything we've heard from the friends so far and everything we're going to hear about them, I've termed for myself, this is all the theology of the comfortable. This is the theology that you can say when things are going well for you. God doesn't give anyone more than they can stand. Whatever happens is God's will. We just accept it. This is easy theology when things are fine for you, right? But this is not something usually that the afflicted themselves might say. There are examples where they will, but this is not, I will really suggest, anything that anyone should say to anyone who is suffering. This is not comfort. Okay, so we're moving quickly, but that's what we need to do today. We're going to go to the third friend, Zophar, the Naamathite. Zophar gets the least play. He speaks the least. One commentator's words about Zophar here was, there's little new to say, however many ways there are to say it. Zophar's not coming in with any new ideas here. He's repetitive, he's derivative, but he, like his other friends, as far as I'm concerned, is also brutal. So verses 1-6 in chapter 11, then Zophar the Naamathite spoke out and he said, is a swarm of words be unanswered? And should a smooth talker be in the right? Because again, Job has answered Bildad's poetry speech with his own. And now Zophar is saying, you're just saying so much. How can I not say more? This is just one, guy who needs to talk after another. They're just all saying, if you talk so much, I'm going to talk more. Over and over. And should a smooth talker be in the right? Just because you have some beautiful poetry, Job, Does that mean you're right? Your lies may silence folk. You mock and no one protests. Just notice that from comfort, we've already moved to accusation, right? He's now a liar. And you say, my teaching is spotless and I've been innocent in your sight. Yet if only God would speak and God would open God's lips against you, God would tell you the secrets of wisdom. For prudence is double-edged, and no, God leaves some of your crime forgotten. As if all of these sufferings weren't enough for Job, his dear friend, Zophar, lets him know that you actually even deserve more, Job, that God is holding back something from the punishment you actually deserve. I mean, with friends like these, truly, right? It's unconscionable. And I want to suggest, as we get to the end of this round, and before we look at what Job says in response, I just want to suggest that if Dr. Schindlin's correct, and that Job is not a book of philosophy, but a book of poetry for consolation, part of the consolation is in getting to express how terrible, how difficult, how much suffering you're in. And the expression of it, the truth of the expression is where consolation or comfort comes. Not from what the friends say. And if anything, for those of us, I saw Sharon, in the chat says, nothing like attacking the mourner for mourning. Been there recently, and I'm so sorry, right? But in some ways, seeing the truth that people, even whether they're well-meaning, are so cruel. In a sense, I want to suggest that for a mourner who's been attacked for their mourning, it might be cold comfort, but it is some consolation to know that this is how people respond and react. Usually quite poorly, quite thoughtlessly, and quite ineffectively. We can separate intent and impact. And they just don't do a good job. So let's see what Job says, and then I'll take some questions and comments. Job responds in 3 chapters here after this first cycle, and I've just got little pieces. The beginning of chapter 12, 1-3, and Job spoke up and said, oh yes, you are the people, and with you wisdom will die. But I too have a mind like you. I am no less than you. And who does not know such things? He just utterly rejects everything they say to him. Chapter 13 begins, my eye has seen all this. My ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I know also. I am not less than you. He feels their patronizing, condescending manner, right? He knows, indeed, I would speak to Shaddai. I insist on arguing not with you, but with God. I'm not listening with any of you. But you invent lies. All of you are quacks. And if you're interested in the word choice, I will tell you, I saw it in more than one translation. All of you are quacks. If you would only keep quiet, it would be considered wisdom on your part. You may have noticed this is not the first time we've seen this idea. Just being quiet, it's not showing us the good way to be with the mourner until now. If we had just stopped at the end of the 2nd chapter, sit with someone in silence, just be there with them. If they want to talk, they'll talk. You don't need to give them your wisdom. Okay. And then just to close this part off, chapter 14 begins, man born of woman, scant of days and sated with trouble. He blossoms like a flower and withers. He vanishes like a shadow, he will not stay. Do you fix your gaze on such a one? Will you go to law with me? The next verse is in parenthetical expression because several translators think that it might not actually belong, but they kept it in. Who can produce a clean thing out of an unclean one? No one. His days are determined. You know the number of his months. You have set him limits that he cannot pass. Turn away from him that he may be at ease until, like one hired, he finishes out his day. Who among us has not seen this? Someone who was vibrant, just fade away. The life force just draining out of them. And Job, after two more cycles of this, two more cycles of the friends each taking a turn and Job responding, I see his lament here, by the way, when he gives this lament. Anne Lamott, for those of you who know her, she had a great little book on poetry called Help, Thanks, Wow, saying there were three kinds of prayer: help me, thank you, and wow, right? I would add to that, for the Jewish tradition, help, thanks, wow, and ow, ow. You know, this is like echa. It hurts, right? Sometimes we don't even want to say, heal me. We just want to say, it's hurting. It's hurting. And I think that's where we are with his lament. He's just saying, I'm suffering. The friend's journey moves quickly in the first round from any confidence in Job's goodness and ultimate vindication to quickly, as we saw in chapter 11, a suggestion that actually some of Job's sins have been overlooked and he's not getting the full treatment he deserves, to finally, if we looked into the third round, just horrible suggestions that his confidence that he didn't do anything wrong is arrogance, and it is proof of sin. I'm just going to read to you from the end of Eliphaz's third speech in chapter 22. This is verses 5-7. You know that your wickedness is great and that your iniquities have no limit. You exact pledges from your fellows without reason and leave them naked, stripped of their clothes. You do not give the thirsty water to drink. You deny bread to the hungry. He only has accusations, these friends. And I'm going to stop here for questions, and then we're going to move on to Job's next response, which is going to be his own oath of innocence. But let me just stop for a minute and take a few questions. Any questions, or should I keep going? Okay, we'll cover more. I'll try to see if we can stop at the end. Okay, so Job's oath of innocence is breathtakingly beautiful. I'm going to read just a little bit of it for you from a translation by the poet Stephen Mitchell. If only I could return to the days when God was my guardian, when his fire blazed above me and guided me in the dark, to the days when I was in blossom and God was a hedge around me, when he hadn't yet deserted me and my children sat at my side. As I walked to the square of the city and took my seat of honor, young men held their breath, old men rose to their feet, rich men stopped speaking and put their fingers to their lips. You can just hear, oh, those days, I remember them, and it was for him like weeks ago, this is just, it all went so fast, but it feels like another world. And he talked about the reason why his neighbors respected him. For I rescued the poor, the desperate, those who had nowhere to turn. I brought relief to the beggar and joy to the widow's heart. I served as eyes for the blind, hands and feet for the crippled, and I thought, I will live many years, growing as old as a palm tree. And here's his lament. And now I am jeered at by street boys, whose fathers I would have considered unfit to take care of my dogs. They snigger behind my back. They stand behind me and sneer. How the mighty have fallen. And I want to get now to, I'm so glad we have time for this. Now something really, to me, fascinating happens. After Job finishes speaking in chapter 31, it says in Hebrew, Tamu divrei Iyov. The words of Job are at an end. And after this, you would expect maybe what happens in chapter 38 to happen. God comes and responds. That should be the next thing that happens. Job's words are over. The friend's third cycle is done. Let's hear from God. But there is this strange interpolation now. Chapters 32 through 37 are this new character we haven't heard from up until now. He's not in the frame story. There's a guy named Elihu. And one of my favorite translators called these chapters Elihu interrupts, right? We wanted to go right to God, but Elihu comes up. And to me, there's a lot of commentators who say Elihu shouldn't be in here. He was a later addition. The poetry's not as good, right? Why is he here? To me, he makes everything clear about what this author wants us to know. This is Elihu, how we're introduced to him. Chapter 32, verses 1 through 10. These three men, the friends, ceased replying to Job, for he considered himself right? They weren't going to talk to him anymore. And Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite, of the family of Ram, was angry at Job because he thought himself right. And I love this. Elihu, let me see if I can find this. The literal meaning of Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite from the clan of Ram, is, he is my God. The Son of God has blessed the scornful one from the high clan. Okay, so he's filled with all kinds of feeling he's the smartest, the best. Okay, so let me see. Okay, here we are. Let's hear what Elihu has to say. He was angry not only at Job, but at his three friends, because they found no reply, but merely condemned Job, right? So he's angry at Job. He's angry at the friends. And Elihu waited out Job's speech, for they were all older than he. He's the young whippersnapper in the group. But when Elihu saw that the three men had nothing to reply, he was angry. Again, this anger is his characteristic. And he says, I have but few years, but while you are old, therefore I was too awestruck and fearful to hold forth among you. I thought, let age speak, let advanced years declare wise things. But truly it's the spirit in men, the breath of Shaddai that gives them understanding. You all might be older and wiser, but you know what? The fact that I'm breathing is what gives me my wisdom, and I'm going to speak. Therefore, I say, listen to me. I too would hold forth. This is where I get his mansplaining title from. Listen to me. I too would hold forth, right? It seems like he just wants them to listen to him. Who is he? He's not even a friend. What does he know about anything? And when he comes in, he just has, more bile to say. Louis Ginsburg, who called him Elihu the intruder, says his speeches are long-winded and turgid. And he says, I love this quote, "The effort required to understand the Elihu speeches is all out of proportion to the profundity of thought," right? It's more work than it's worth to understand what he says, right? And the thing that I think Elihu is teaching us is that he is the problem of the friends run wild. He, in effect, if I may make this parallel, is the worst of social media, of people who have no idea what's going on in a situation, holding forth on it, pretending they're part of it, asserting their right to speak about things that they have nothing to do with, right? He wants to give his take when everybody's take, we'll find out next time, is wrong, is unnecessary, and I would say creates more suffering. When I titled this group of classes, "Whose Test Is It?" we have the idea in the first class, right? We read that this was Job's test. Today, I'm suggesting here in the second class that the test might have been the friends, at least for the author of the book of Job, since he spends so much time, the bulk of the book on the friends and Job and Elihu. And I believe he's telling us that all of the friends failed. And we'll see this affirmed next week when we see what God has to say all about that. Just to be clear, we start with the friends who start beautifully, coming to their beloved friend's side and sitting with him in silence. But then when they need to justify what's happening, instead of just supporting and being present to their friends, when they focus more on their own opinions and need to be heard, then they fail their own tests. And basically, they prove that if you say, "This is how God works," you are either selling something, right? Or you are failing a test. Because as we're going to hear, even when they said things that might have even been similar to what God will say, the speaker matters. And God can say things that the friends cannot. Okay, thank you for letting me get through all of that. Let's go to some questions or comments. Feel free to raise a hand if you want Julie to call on you, or we'll try to look back into the chat and see if, feel free to post new questions. We'll get to as many as we can.
Andy?
Hi, I just posted something in the chat, but my take on this is that if you have grown up in this environment where everything is determined, God is perfect and so forth, it hurts so much to think that life, basically, if you don't believe this, life is meaningless, which happened in the early 20th century to a lot of people. So it might be better to think I must have some hidden flaw than to think life has no meaning.
Absolutely. And, that's why we have this, that's one of the functions of the fable, right? The first two chapters, which is of such different character, right, than this middle section, because how could we otherwise ever have, unless they told us that Job wasn't responsible for this suffering, how could we ever not know that, right? So we'll never get that kind of guarantee. But one thing that I think that this book does as a book of consolation actually achieves is it says It's not your business to know who suffers and for what reason. It's not knowable to us, right? And for some people, it may be comforting, but for the ones who it is not comforting, it's certainly not something to tell them. Thank you for your comment.
Do you want me to ask questions that came in?
Sure, sure.
So someone asked, but nothing bad happens to the friends. How are we supposed to take that outcome?
Yes. So we're going to, in our next class, we're going to see what choice words God has for the friends and what actually happens to them. But you're correct. The point of the book isn't to take Job's suffering and transfer it to anyone else, right? We will see that the friends are addressed, right? But this doesn't seem to be a place where they have to make amends. They're told to make amends. But this again seems to be like, this is what I want to say. For friends who were focused on the divine being a source of punishment to Job, the divine does not seem to want to reinforce that idea that God is a punisher for reasons of vengeance or to create more suffering. God has different plans.
Here's an interesting question in the chat from Rebecca. Can you contrast the message in Job with that of Ecclesiastes?
That's a great question. And I think, something that is both similar and different is that Kohelet is also a man who has experienced, everything, and by living a full life, he's actually kind of nothing horrible ever happened to him, but it felt horrible just to be in a world where he wasn't convinced there was meaning, right? Both books, I think, like really any book of the Torah, are asking the question, what is a meaningful life? How do I live a meaningful life? And they just have different complications that bring them to that question. And they are similar also in a formal way, that the book moves in one direction, like almost for the entire book. And then at the end, you have something that feels like it was tacked on, that is not of a piece with the rest of it. Right? So both books, in a sense, many scholars think, are kind of airing more radical views than other, canon fixers were comfortable with. And so they both kind of have these neat, pat endings after being, stirring up a lot of trouble. Great question.
A couple people commented and asked, does the book teach us that the only thing we can do for the suffering is to sit and listen?
It seems so here. It seems that's the wisdom they're trying to tell us over and over. I think that I think we might have seen them wash their feet, right? I think we can see them doing acts of chesed, right? It didn't say they brought them meals, right? But we can imagine that, right? It doesn't mean, there's nothing to do. It just means there's nothing to say, right? In terms of justifying. What you can say, right, is, I'm so sorry, right? I'm so sorry, right? And I think it's ironic, because the whole point of the book, by its poetry, is that words itself are consolation, but it really matters who is saying the words, right? And when they're saying them, and to whom they're saying them. So words are celebrated. This is some of the most gorgeous poetry we have in our canon. But you have to be really careful when you're talking to someone in deep suffering. I think that's the message. Yeah. Well, we got through a lot of material quickly today. I hope in our next meeting, we'll be able to slow down a little bit and continue to think about the friends and Job and, what is such a compelling question. What does God have to say about all of this? And amazingly, the author brings God to give us, again, some of the most beautiful poetry that we'll find in the whole book. So I will look forward to our learning together next week. Thank you so much for making the time and to bringing your thoughtful comments and questions to this learning community.